Eyes in the dark, stalked in the forest. It was a cool autumn evening when we decided to go on a hike. My friends and I, a tight-knit group of adventure seekers, had planned this trip for weeks. The forest we chose was vast, sprawling over miles of land, untouched by modern civilization. It was known for its eerie stillness and the strange things that seemed to lurk just beyond the treeline. We weren't scared, well, not at first. There were 4 of us: Emma, the brave one; Lucas, the practical thinker; Sophie, who loved photography; and me, Jason, the storyteller. We set off at sunset, eager to capture the beauty of the forest before nightfall. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the sunlight began to fade, casting long shadows across the narrow path. The leaves crunched under our boots, and the air grew cooler with each step. Sophie was snapping pictures, capturing every rustling leaf and gnarled tree. Emma led the way, her head held high as she confidently navigated the rough terrain. Lucas, always with a map in hand, kept track of our location, while I, as usual, was busy telling ghost stories to pass the time. We had been walking for about 2 hours when the forest suddenly felt different. The sounds around us, the chirping of birds and rustling of animals, had all stopped. It was an unnatural silence, the kind that sends a chill down your spine. Sophie stopped and looked around, her camera in hand. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just your imagination," Lucas replied, though his eyes darted nervously to the shadows. But Sophie wasn't convinced. She pointed to the trees ahead, where the branches seemed to sway unnaturally, as though something large was moving between them. We all stared, straining to see in the dim light, but there was nothing there. "Let's keep moving," Emma suggested, eager to keep the pace going. She led us down a narrow path that seemed to wind deeper into the heart of the forest. But as we moved forward, something felt off. The air grew heavier, and every crackling leaf beneath our feet felt like a loud echo in the stillness. We hadn't noticed how far we had gone until we reached a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a large, crumbling stone structure, half covered in ivy and moss. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. We approached cautiously, and Sophie took more photos, documenting every angle. There was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, a soft rustling sound came from behind us. We all turned in unison, but there was nothing there. Only the dark forest stretching out into the distance. Emma, who had always been the brave one, motioned for us to stay quiet. "We need to head back," she said, her voice tense. We retraced our steps, but the forest around us seemed different now, darker, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in on us, the branches overhead intertwining to form a canopy so thick that little light filtered through. And then, we heard footsteps, heavy and slow, following just behind us. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were multiple, scattering around us, getting closer with every passing moment. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. The forest was still and silent once more. "Stay calm," Lucas said, trying to reassure us, though his voice trembled. "It's just animals." But we knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too deliberate, too synchronized. Someone or something was following us. My heart raced, and a sense of dread washed over me. We quickened our pace, but the sound of footsteps grew louder. Emma, always the leader, broke into a sprint, urging us to follow her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows, just out of sight. Suddenly, we heard a low growl, not from any animal we knew, but from deep in the forest. We froze, each of us looking for the source of the sound. And then, we saw eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, staring at us from between the trees. It wasn't one pair of eyes. There were dozens of them, all watching us, unblinking, unmoving. We couldn't see the creatures behind them, only the eyes, each glowing with an unnatural light. "Run!" Emma screamed, and we all bolted in different directions, terror pushing us to move faster than we ever had before. I glanced over my shoulder, and the eyes were still there, following us, always watching, always closing in. We ran for what felt like hours, dodging trees, tripping over roots, until finally, we stumbled upon the edge of the forest. The eyes were gone, the strange presence had lifted, but the fear remained. We didn't speak much after that, too shaken by the experience. But we knew one thing for certain: we would never return to that forest again. Whatever was out there, lurking in the dark, watching with its glowing eyes, was something we could never explain. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of all. The missing tent mate, the terrifying secret we found on our camping trip. This story is about what happened to me and 3 of my college friends when we decided to go on a camping trip deep into the wilderness. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, but it turned into something much more terrifying than we could have ever imagined. We were all tired of the noise and chaos of city life. So, after much planning, we decided to head to a remote camping site that none of us had ever been to before. It was located in a dense forest, far from the nearest town, and according to the maps, it was rarely visited by other campers. This appealed to us because we wanted peace and solitude. What we didn't know was that the forest held dark secrets that would change us forever. The strange stranger. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The air was cool, and a heavy fog was beginning to settle in. We set up our tents and started a campfire to cook dinner. It was the perfect night for telling stories and enjoying each other's company. But as night deepened, something felt off. The forest around us was eerily silent, with no animal sounds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just a strange, thick quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We shrugged it off, deciding it was just our nerves. That's when we saw him. A man emerged from the darkness, stepping out of the trees and into the clearing where we had set up our camp. He was tall, his face hidden by a thick beard, and he wore an old, tattered coat. His eyes seemed sunken, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look like he was lost, he looked like he had been in the forest for a long time. "Evening," he said in a gravelly voice. "Be careful around here. The forest isn't as empty as it seems." We exchanged confused looks. "Who are you?" asked my friend Emma. He ignored her question and continued, "It's not safe to camp here. People have gone missing. It's better to leave before nightfall." We tried to ask him more, but he simply turned around and walked back into the darkness without another word. We were unsettled, but dismissed him as just another wanderer, maybe someone who had gotten lost or was just a bit crazy. The disappearance of Mike. That night, as we sat around the fire, we couldn't shake off the man's words. But as tiredness overcame us, we finally went to bed. The next morning, things took a turn for the worse. Our friend Mike, who had been sleeping in a separate tent, was gone. At first, we thought maybe he had gone to explore the woods or take a walk, but when we checked his tent, everything was in place: his sleeping bag, his clothes, even his phone. There was no sign of struggle, but there was a strange feeling that something wasn't right. We searched the campsite and the surrounding woods, calling out his name, but there was no answer. Hours passed, and as panic began to set in, we realized Mike had simply vanished. There were no clues, no footprints, nothing to suggest where he had gone. As the day wore on and we still couldn't find him, we noticed something chilling. Strange marks had appeared on the trees near the edge of the forest. At first, they seemed like random scratches, but upon closer inspection, we realized they were words, crudely carved into the bark. "Don't follow me." We were terrified. The eerie silence of the forest had become unbearable, and the man's warning echoed in our minds. But we couldn't just leave without finding Mike, so we pressed on, following the strange markings deeper into the woods. A horrifying discovery. We walked for hours, the trees growing denser as we ventured further from the campsite. The air grew colder, and an unnatural fog started to roll in, obscuring our vision. Just as we were beginning to lose hope, we heard a faint sound in the distance, a whisper, like someone calling our names. We ran toward it, our hearts pounding in our chests. And then, through the thick fog, we saw him, Mike. But he wasn't the same. His eyes were wide and empty, his skin pale, his body shaking uncontrollably. He was staring at us, but it was like he didn't recognize us at all. "Mike, are you okay?" I asked, approaching him cautiously. His lips trembled as he whispered, "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have followed me." And then, with a sudden and violent motion, he grabbed my arm and pulled me closer, his cold fingers digging into my skin. "You don't understand," he hissed. "It's watching us. It's been watching us since we got here. It won't let us leave." Before I could respond, he let go and stumbled backward, his body jerking in unnatural ways. He started to run, disappearing into the mist, his footsteps fading into the distance. We stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. Mike was gone again, swallowed by the forest. The truth behind the forest. We spent the rest of the day trying to find Mike, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. We eventually gave up, exhausted and terrified. We returned to the campsite, packed up our gear, and left as quickly as possible. When we got back to the nearest town, we contacted the authorities, but when they sent a team to search the forest, there was no sign of Mike or any of the strange markings we had found. The police told us that there had been reports of strange disappearances in the area for years, but they could never find any evidence of foul play. The forest, they said, had a history of strange events, but they couldn't explain it. Years later, we learned the truth. The forest wasn't just haunted by spirits, it was alive. There was something in the trees, something ancient and malevolent, that hunted those who dared to venture too deep. It marked its victims, guiding them into the forest's depths where they would disappear without a trace. We were lucky to escape, but Mike, he's still out there. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the woods, I hear his voice calling from the darkness, warning me not to return. The hidden lake, a nightmare encounter in the wilderness. Alex, Nina, and David had been planning their wilderness escape for years. Finally, the day had arrived. They set off for what they believed would be the ultimate adventure, the hidden lake. Located deep in a remote forest, this lake was said to be unreachable by normal means. There were rumors and legends of people disappearing around it, but to the trio, these were just stories. They were ready to prove that it was nothing more than myths. The hike was going well at first. The forest was dense, but the air was fresh, and the sounds of nature surrounded them. As they walked, they marveled at the towering trees and the wildlife that seemed to be everywhere. By the time they reached the lake, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the water. However, something felt off. A thick, eerie mist had settled on the lake's surface, almost as if it were hiding something. The first night, they set up camp beside the water, a safe distance from the edge but close enough to hear the soft lapping of the water. The group sat around a crackling fire, laughing and chatting, but the air felt colder than it should have been. Alex noticed that David seemed a little on edge, staring at the woods with a frown. "I'm sure it's nothing," David said, trying to shake off the unease. "But does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Nina laughed, brushing it off. "You're just tired. It's probably just some animals in the woods." But despite Nina's reassurances, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and walked toward the edge of the water. The light danced over the ripples, but everything seemed still. No movement. No sound. Then, as he was about to turn back, something in the distance caught his eye, a figure, standing motionless in the water. David's heart skipped a beat. "Guys," he whispered hoarsely, his voice shaking. But when Alex and Nina turned to look, the figure was gone. Only the lake remained, dark and calm. The next day, the group tried to brush off the strange incident. But when they woke up the next morning, Nina was missing. Her tent had been torn open, her belongings scattered across the ground. But Nina was nowhere to be found. Panic started to set in. "She couldn't have gone far," Alex said, trying to stay calm. They searched the surrounding area, calling her name, but there was no answer. After what felt like hours, Nina emerged from the woods, disoriented and dazed. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened," she stammered. I had a dream, or maybe it was real, I don't know. I walked out into the woods, and it felt like someone was pulling me." David and Alex exchanged worried glances but said nothing. They decided to stay together and leave the area the next day. But first, they decided to explore more of the lake's perimeter, hoping to find an exit from the wilderness. As they walked, something began to feel wrong again. They had passed the same patch of trees 3 times now. Their GPS was malfunctioning, and the compass spun endlessly. It was as if the forest itself was playing tricks on them. The second night. That evening, they set up their camp again, but none of them felt safe. The sounds of the forest seemed louder than usual, an overwhelming, unsettling hum. As they sat by the fire, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread, they heard it, soft whispers coming from the woods. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but the whispering grew louder. It wasn't clear, just faint words they couldn't quite make out. David stood up, his heart racing. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could answer, he spun around, shining the flashlight into the trees. There, in the shadows, was a tall, pale figure, standing perfectly still, staring directly at them. Nina screamed. Alex lunged forward, grabbing her arm, trying to pull her away. But David's legs wouldn't move. His eyes were locked on the figure. The moment seemed to stretch on forever until the figure suddenly vanished, melting back into the trees like smoke. They immediately packed up their things and decided to leave the lake behind, but as they turned to leave, the woods seemed to close in on them. It was as if the forest itself was pushing them back toward the lake. Escape. Running through the trees, they tried to make their way out of the woods. But every path they took led them back to the lake. They were trapped in a loop, stuck within the same spot over and over again. Then, as if by some divine intervention, they spotted a narrow gap between two massive trees. It was small but big enough to crawl through. Without thinking, they squeezed through and continued running until the sounds of the forest fell silent. When they finally broke through to the open, the forest behind them was completely still. The lake was nowhere to be seen. "What just happened?" Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper. David looked at him, his face pale. I don't know, but I feel like we were never supposed to leave." Aftermath. The trio tried to make sense of what they had experienced. They returned to their normal lives, but something had changed. No matter how hard they tried, they could never find the hidden lake again. Maps, coordinates, and satellite images all showed nothing. It was as if the lake had never existed. But the most unsettling thing of all was Nina's injury. A strange, twisted mark on her wrist, as if something had grabbed her in the night. It was a burn, deep and jagged, and as time passed, the mark only grew worse. Every night, Nina would wake up in a cold sweat, whispering about the lake calling her back. And every night, they feared that it was only a matter of time before the lake came for them again. Silent witnesses of the woods, the horrifying sounds of the night. When night falls over the forest, a deep silence reigns, or so it seems. However, sometimes, sounds that should not be heard begin to rise. This is the tale of something that should remain unheard, yet cannot be avoided, as the silent witnesses of the woods make their presence known. Arda was a young man who loved nature and had a deep passion for photography. He enjoyed exploring alone, often venturing into places others avoided. Little did he know, the terror awaiting him was beyond anything he could imagine. One autumn day, he decided to explore a mysterious forest, one not marked on most maps, known by locals as the Silent Trees. Legends surrounded this place, with tales of those who ventured there never returning. Arda, however, dismissed these stories as nothing more than local folklore. He planned a day trip to the forest, intending to camp for a night and take some photographs. The sun was still high as he entered the woods, surrounded by trees whose trunks seemed ancient and worn. The sounds of birds singing filled the air, the rustling of the wind moving the leaves gently. It was peaceful, even beautiful. But as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, a strange feeling took root in his chest. The silence deepened. The wind had stopped, and there was an odd stillness in the air. By dusk, Arda had set up his tent, his camera ready for the next day's exploration. He lit a small campfire and sat back, enjoying the tranquility. The fire crackled, the only sound for miles. However, as night fully fell, things began to change. Strange noises, at first barely noticeable, began to seep into the forest. The wind, which had been absent, suddenly whispered, but it wasn't the kind of whisper you would expect. It wasn't the soft rustle of leaves or the gentle breeze swaying the branches. No, this was different. The whispers were distinct, like voices carried on the wind, murmuring in a language Arda could not understand. At first, he brushed it off as his mind playing tricks on him. The isolation was getting to him, he thought. But then the noises grew louder. The whispers became words. Turn back, before it's too late. Arda froze. His heart began to race, a chill running down his spine. The sound was coming from all around him, yet there was no one in sight. He quickly grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but there was nothing there. The light illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. The forest was silent again. Did I imagine it? Arda whispered to himself, but deep down, he knew he hadn't. He could feel something was wrong. Something in the air, in the very fabric of the forest, had shifted. He wasn't alone. As the hours passed, the noises didn't subside. If anything, they grew louder. High-pitched, almost childlike cries echoed through the trees, the sounds of footsteps running through the underbrush, but when he would turn to look, nothing was there. The fire seemed to flicker and dim with every sound, its light unable to fight off the growing darkness. Then, as he sat by the fire, the flames suddenly sputtered and flickered violently, almost as if something was sucking the life out of them. Arda stood up, looking around, trying to understand what was happening. That's when he saw it. In the distance, a shadow stood among the trees. It wasn't a person, at least, it didn't look human. It was too tall, too still. It seemed to blend into the darkness, its features indistinguishable. Yet, Arda knew it was watching him. He could feel its eyes, even though he couldn't see them. The silence that followed was deafening. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the figure. It didn't move, didn't speak. It was simply there, a dark presence in the night. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Vanished without a trace. Arda's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, trying to convince himself it had just been a trick of the light. But deep down, he knew better. The whispers returned, louder now. It's already too late. The voice was not in his ears, but in his mind, as if someone or something was speaking directly to him, inside his very thoughts. The fear surged within him, but he could not tear himself away. The whispers grew more frantic, more insistent. Come closer, we see you. Terrified, Arda grabbed his things and started to pack up his camp. His hands shook as he stuffed his belongings into his bag, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They echoed in his head, filling his every thought, blocking out reason. He heard the rustling of leaves behind him. Footsteps, slowly getting closer. He swung around, but there was no one there. His pulse raced. He ran. His footsteps were loud and frantic as he dashed through the forest, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. He stumbled over roots and rocks, every movement a frantic scramble to escape the growing sense of dread that followed him. Finally, after what felt like hours, he broke free from the forest's grip. The trees thinned out, and the darkness began to lift as he approached the edge of the woods. He looked back, half expecting something to follow him, but nothing did. The woods were silent again, as if nothing had happened at all. Arda didn't stop running until he reached his car, but even then, he felt the weight of the forest pressing on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, even now, even from a distance. He drove home in a daze, unable to shake the images of the shadow and the voices that had haunted him. The next day, as he reflected on what had happened, Arda tried to convince himself that it had been nothing more than his imagination. But deep down, he knew that the forest had left its mark on him. It wasn't just the sounds, the whispers, or the shadowy figure. It was the feeling that he had somehow become a part of something much older, much darker than he could ever have understood. Weeks later, Arda couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. He would hear the whispers again, sometimes faint, sometimes clear, always in the back of his mind. At night, he would wake up, his heart pounding, certain that something was there, just beyond the edge of his vision. And one evening, while hiking near a different forest, Arda noticed something strange. He looked at the bark of a tree and saw, etched into the surface, a symbol, a face, distorted and twisted, as if carved by something other than human hands. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. It was the same symbol, the same face he had seen etched into the trees of the silent trees. Suddenly, a voice whispered in his ear, clear as day. "You're one of us now." Art had turned around, but no one was there. The forest had claimed him, just as it claimed all those before him. The silent witnesses of the woods had made him a part of their dark world, a world that could never be escaped once it had its hold on you. He was never the same after that night. And the whispers? They never stopped. The end. The mystery of the disappearing hikers, the campground's dark secret. Camping in the wilderness is often seen as an escape, a chance to reconnect with nature and leave behind the chaos of everyday life. But sometimes, nature hides more than just peace. Sometimes, it hides secrets that should never be uncovered. My friends and I, Ken, AJ, Murat, and I decided to take a break from the city during our university's spring break. We wanted adventure, and what better place to find it than in the heart of an ancient forest? This particular campsite was near an old hunter's cabin and a serene lake known for its breathtaking views. But there was one more thing about this place. It was rumored that several campers had mysteriously vanished in these woods over the years. We were skeptical. Urban legends, ghost stories, everyone's heard them. Surely, those stories were exaggerated or outright fabricated. We were just here for the weekend to escape and have fun, not to dig into the eerie tales of missing people. By the time we arrived at the campsite, the sun was setting behind the thick forest. We quickly set up our tents, started a fire, and unpacked our food. The crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees created an eerie yet tranquil atmosphere. As night fell, we began to hear something, footsteps. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of someone walking through the brush. "Is someone out there?" I called out. There was no response. We all looked at each other, uneasy. Ken grabbed the flashlight and scanned the woods, but there was nothing, just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. Murat, always the practical one, shrugged. Probably just a deer or something. Or maybe a raccoon. But AJ wasn't convinced. "I've heard stories about this place. People have gone missing here, right?" We all went quiet for a moment. She was right, but none of us really wanted to entertain the thought. We decided to push it out of our minds and enjoy the evening. But later, as I lay in my tent, I swore I heard something. Low, almost imperceptible whispers. They sounded like words, but the language was foreign, garbled. I convinced myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, as the sun rose and the mist began to lift, we noticed something strange. Scattered around the campsite were odd symbols carved into the trees. The bark had been scratched off in places, and on the ground were strange markings that looked like they had been drawn in the dirt. Who the hell would do this? Murat muttered as he knelt down to examine one of the symbols more closely. AJ shuddered. This isn't normal. Could someone else be here? We all felt the unease settle in again. It was a creepy feeling, like we weren't alone. But none of us could figure out if it was some sort of prank or if something more sinister was at play. We spent the rest of the day by the lake, trying to shake off the feeling. We fished, swam, and tried to enjoy the natural beauty surrounding us. But every now and then, we catch glimpses of something strange out of the corner of our eyes, movement in the trees, shadows shifting where there shouldn't be any. That night, the air grew cold. We sat around the fire, chatting, trying to distract ourselves from the unease that seemed to follow us. It was around midnight when the scream tore through the night. Ken was gone. We all shot up, our hearts pounding in our chests. The fire crackled in the silence, casting long shadows across the campsite. His tent was empty, the zipper wide open. There were no signs of a struggle, but there were strange marks on the ground, footprints that led into the dark woods and suddenly stopped. "Ken," we called, frantic. But there was no answer. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the woods, calling out for him. But the forest was thick, the trees heavy with shadows. We walked for hours, the cold biting at our skin, our hearts sinking with every step. Every now and then, we'd hear a rustling sound, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. Finally, we reached the old hunter's cabin. The door was slightly ajar. We hesitated, fear crawling up our spines. "Do you think he's in there?" AJ whispered. We didn't know what to think anymore, but we had to check. We stepped inside. The cabin was dark and musty, with old furniture covered in layers of dust. On the walls were strange, charcoal markings. Symbols. Like the ones we had seen outside. But the most disturbing thing was the message written on the wall in bold strokes. They hide in the shadows. Suddenly, we heard a noise, a low, almost guttural growl. Something in the corner of the room moved. We bolted out of the cabin, nearly tripping over our feet as we ran back to the campsite. We didn't stop running until we reached the road. The next morning, we went to the local police. We told them everything, but when we mentioned the strange symbols and the hunter's cabin, the officer's face changed. "I thought it was just a legend," he murmured. "But you're not the first to encounter this, whatever it is. People have been disappearing in those woods for years. Nobody knows what happens to them." We didn't get a straight answer, but the officer's look told us everything we needed to know. The woods weren't just dangerous, they were cursed. We never found Ken. The police searched for days, but they found nothing. Not even his body. Some of the locals claim to hear whispers in the trees at night, but no one dares to go back to the campsite. The missing hikers, the eerie symbols, and the things that lurk in the shadows of the forest are still a mystery. If you ever find yourself near that old hunter's cabin, remember this. If you hear whispers in the dark, don't go into the woods. Because once they see you, you'll never leave. The light that vanished, a true camping horror story. My name is Jake, and what I experienced in the summer of 2018 is something I will never forget. At that time, I was in university, and a group of friends and I decided to go on a camping trip in the wilderness. We had the idea to get away for a few days, disconnect from technology, pitch tents in the forest, light a campfire, and enjoy the beauty of nature. The beginning. We arrived at the campsite just as the sky started to darken. The place was located about 2 hours from the nearest town, deep in a rarely visited forest. When we reached the end of the long, winding road, we parked the car and began walking into the woods to set up our tents. We joked and laughed along the way, but there was something odd about the atmosphere. The forest was eerily silent. There were no birds chirping, no buzzing insects. It felt as if nature itself had gone quiet. "Strange," I muttered under my breath, but my friends didn't seem to notice or care. We eventually reached a clearing, set up our campsite, and started a fire. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. That's when I saw it. A faint, strange light in the distance. The strange light. The light appeared to be about 100 meters away, deep among the trees. At first, I thought it might be another camper's flashlight, but the way it moved was different. It seemed to float, casting a soft glow, without any apparent source or movement. It wasn't a typical flashlight beam, it had an unnatural, almost ethereal quality to it. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Everyone turned toward the light. We all stared in silence, watching it flicker in the distance. Then, without warning, it disappeared. Just like that. "Maybe it's someone else camping nearby," Sam suggested, but the place we were at wasn't known for being a popular destination. We were miles away from any established campsites. We tried to brush it off and continued our evening, but an uneasy feeling settled in our minds. We figured the light was nothing more than a trick of our eyes, or perhaps some hikers further into the woods. As we chatted around the campfire, something else happened. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound came from deeper within the forest. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone was speaking softly from far away. But the words? We couldn't make them out. The night grew darker, and despite the unsettling events, we all eventually fell asleep, one by one. The second night. The next night, we were more on edge. We joked nervously, trying to convince ourselves that there was nothing strange going on. Maybe we were just tired from the hike and the silence of the woods was playing tricks on our minds. But then, just after midnight, the light appeared again. It was closer this time, hovering between the trees at the edge of our campsite. It wasn't a simple flashlight, it moved in a peculiar, slow, almost purposeful way. And once again, it vanished before we could get a closer look. We all froze, staring at the spot where the light had been. The air felt thick with tension. "I don't like this." "Let's go," Sam said, his voice shaky with fear. We packed up our things quickly, and as we started to make our way toward the car, we realized the light was still there. But now, it was following us. We picked up the pace, walking quickly through the woods, but no matter how fast we moved, the light stayed just behind us, flickering in the distance. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to keep calm. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder this time, coming from all directions. It felt as if the voices were surrounding us, as if the forest itself was alive with unearthly energy. The terrifying discovery. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Once inside, we slammed the door shut, and I couldn't resist glancing into the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the light again, now closer than before, just outside the edge of the woods. But then, as we sped away, it was gone. We didn't speak much as we drove back. The air was thick with an unspoken understanding, something wasn't right. Something was out there in those woods. Later, back at home, we did some research. The forest where we had camped was known for its eerie history. There were reports of hikers and campers disappearing over the years, with no trace left behind. We learned about several strange incidents, but what disturbed us the most was a story from the 1970s. A group of campers had gone missing in that very same forest. They had been the last known people to camp there, and after their disappearance, the site had been abandoned. The aftermath. We never returned to that forest. To this day, none of us have been able to shake the memory of that light. Was it a spirit? Was it something from the forest itself, watching and waiting? We don't know. We tried to tell others, but no one believed us. It was as if the forest wanted to keep its secrets. We still talk about it sometimes, late at night, when the silence feels too heavy. But whatever it was that followed us that night, it's something that none of us will ever forget. The end. A hidden threat in the campsite, time running out in the forest. It was a crisp autumn morning when a group of friends decided to escape the hustle of city life for a weekend camping trip. Forth and Ethan, Sarah, Liam, and Rachel had always sought the adventure of the gray outdoors. This time, they decided to set up camp deep within the forest, far from any established campsite or hiking trail. The thrill of isolation was a pull they couldn't resist. After a long drive, they arrived at a quiet patch of forest, dense with towering pines and thick underbrush. It felt untouched by civilization, a perfect place to disconnect. With backpacks full of supplies and spirits high, they set to work pitching their tent near a serene stream that bubbled quietly through the woods. By the time evening approached, they had built a crackling campfire, with the scent of pine smoke filling the air. The forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife, but there was an unsettling stillness beneath it all, as though something was watching them. Liam, always the skeptic, shrugged it off, claiming it was just his imagination. They sat around the fire, telling stories, roasting marshmallows, and enjoying the camaraderie. However, as the fire began to die down and the sky darkened, a strange chill swept over the camp. It wasn't just the temperature, it felt as though the forest itself had grown more silent, as though the creatures within were holding their breath. The once vibrant sounds of the night had dimmed. Sarah noticed a shadow flickering in the corner of her eye, but when she turned, nothing was there. Her unease deepened, but she didn't say anything, unsure whether it was just the darkness playing tricks on her. As the night dragged on, Rachel suggested they turn in early. The exhaustion from the hike, combined with the strange atmosphere, was enough to make the group agree. They crawled into their sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire still lingering in their minds. But just as they were about to fall asleep, a sound cut through the night, a low, guttural growl that came from deep within the forest. The friends froze, heartbeats pounding in their ears. Was it a bear? A wolf? A wild animal? They had no way of knowing, but it sounded close. Too close. Liam, trying to remain calm, grabbed a flashlight from his bag and flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the nearby trees, but nothing was there. The growl had faded, but the tension in the air remained thick. The group stared at each other, unsure of what to do next. "We should check the area," Ethan suggested, his voice low. "Just to be safe." Against their better judgment, the group decided to venture into the woods, armed with flashlights and a sense of growing fear. As they ventured further, the woods seemed to press in on them, the trees more densely packed, the underbrush more tangled. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every rustle in the leaves, made their hearts race. The night had become unnervingly still again, save for their own footsteps. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Liam saw it, a figure, just barely visible, standing motionless among the trees. His breath caught in his throat. The figure seemed humanoid, but it didn't move like a person. It was unnaturally still, with an almost unnatural presence. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Before he could say anything, the figure vanished into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's face went pale. "We need to get back to the camp. Now!" But as they turned to head back, they realized they weren't alone anymore. The air grew heavier, colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. They heard movement behind them, swift, purposeful, and more than just one set of footsteps. They ran. The crunching of leaves underfoot and the heavy thuds of something chasing them spurred them to push forward, but it felt like the forest was conspiring to keep them from finding their way back. They could hear the growling again, closer this time, and the sound of something large moving just behind them. They dared not look back. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon a clearing and saw their campsite in the distance. But the sight of it didn't bring the relief they expected. The campfire, once burning brightly, was now nothing but a few embers smoldering in the night. Their tent was slashed open, the bags ripped apart. And worst of all, their supplies were gone. In that moment, they realized that what had been hunting them wasn't just an animal. Something far more sinister lurked in these woods, something that knew what they feared. But who or what was behind it? And why did they feel like time was running out? The group tried to gather what little they had left, but the atmosphere had grown more oppressive, the forest no longer just a place of wonder, but of terror. In the distance, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps once again. This time, they weren't running, they were closing in. There was no escape, not unless they could figure out how to survive the night. The forest had turned into their worst nightmare, and as the hours passed, it became clearer that the true threat was not of this world. But as the moon climbed higher into the sky, the group would discover that time was not on their side. Screams in the night, a horrific night we couldn't escape. That night, everything started off like any other. My friends and I, for thrill seekers, Ken, AJ, Barack, and Selin, decided to visit an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. It had been rumored to be haunted, and we thought that exploring it in the dead of night would be the ultimate adrenaline rush. Little did we know, that night would become the most terrifying experience of our lives. The first step and the first feeling. When the door creaked open, a musty, damp odor filled the air. The faint beams of our flashlights revealed broken furniture, dark stains on the walls, and dusty old toys scattered across the floor. This mansion had once been the home of a family, but now it was nothing more than a shell of its former self, forgotten and left to decay. For a moment, I felt a strange unease wash over me. AJ, ever the fearless one, laughed and said, "Come on, don't be scared. What's the worst that could happen?" She walked ahead, leading the way. But Barack, a bit quieter, muttered behind me, "This place really gives me a bad vibe." The beginning of the screams. We wandered deeper into the house, our footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The wind howled through the broken windows, causing the old curtains to sway gently. When we decided to go upstairs, a door suddenly slammed shut on its own. We all froze in place. Could it have been the wind? Then, we heard it. A scream. High-pitched and bone-chilling, it echoed from upstairs, almost as if it was a woman in agony. Selin screamed in terror and grabbed Barack's arm. AJ, trying to maintain her composure, whispered, "Is someone messing with us?" But her voice trembled. Despite our fear, we decided to head upstairs. Each step on the old wooden stairs creaked louder than the last, and the sound made my skin crawl. When we reached the top, we saw an old, half-open door to what appeared to be a child's room. We hesitated before entering, but the chilling draft from within seemed to pull us inside. Inside the room, something on the wall caught our attention. It looked like old writing, faded and barely legible. The words seemed to have been written hastily, in a panic. "They left me here. They will stay here too." As I stared at the strange message, I felt an icy chill run down my spine. That's when I saw her. In the corner of the room, sitting in an old, dusty chair, there was a figure. A woman, her face obscured by long, tangled hair, dressed in a tattered white gown. Her eyes were pitch black, staring at us, motionless. Her head tilted slightly as if observing us. The escape wasn't possible. We were frozen in place. My heart raced, and my breath became shallow. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, Selin let out a scream, and we all stumbled backward. The door slammed shut behind us with an eerie force. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Then, a faint, muffled whisper echoed from behind the door. "You're here now." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we tried desperately to get out. The wall seemed to close in on us. Barak, in a frenzy, grabbed a nearby old knife from a drawer and began stabbing the door. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Then, with a final thrust, the door flew open. We bolted down the hallway, but as I glanced back for a split second, I saw her again. The woman. She was no longer sitting in the chair but standing at the end of the hallway, staring directly at me, her eyes blacker than night. No more safe spaces. We ran down the stairs and out the front door as fast as we could. The cold night air hit us like a slap in the face as we piled into the car and sped away, not daring to look back. But that night wasn't the end. In the days that followed, something was wrong. At night, I'd hear faint whispers from the walls, and sometimes I'd wake up to see strange, eerie writing appearing on the surfaces around me. Selin started acting strangely, often staring off into space as if listening to something only she could hear. And then, one night, Selin vanished. We searched for her, but she was gone. The only thing left was a message, scrawled on her bedroom wall. "It's your turn now." The dark sky above, surviving the worst camping nightmare. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. My friends and I had been planning the trip for weeks, looking forward to the quiet serenity of a hidden campsite far away from the usual crowds. The forest we chose was deep, remote, and isolated. Perfect for a camping trip. Or at least, that's what we thought. There were 4 of us, me, Alex, Sophie, and Michael. We all had some experience with camping, but none of us had ever ventured so far off the beaten path before. The area wasn't marked on most maps, but we'd heard stories about it, stories of a mysterious, pristine lake that was untouched by modern hands. It sounded perfect for what we wanted, a weekend without distractions. We arrived at the trailhead early in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. The air was cool, fresh, and carried the earthy scent of pine trees. As we loaded our gear into our backpacks and began our hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The deeper we went into the woods, the quieter it became. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of animals in the brush. Just an eerie, almost oppressive silence. "Hey, are you guys feeling that?" Michael asked, his voice breaking the silence. "It's too quiet, don't you think?" I shrugged it off. "Maybe it's just the time of day," I said. "It's probably just the calm before the nightfall." But even as I said it, a chill ran down my spine. It was late in the season, so maybe it was just the air of autumn creeping in, but the silence felt wrong. By the time we reached the lake, dusk had settled over the forest. The water was eerily still, reflecting the darkening sky. The campsite was small but beautiful, surrounded by dense trees and cliffs on all sides. We set up our tents near the shore, and as we started a fire, the feeling of unease seemed to melt away, replaced by the comforting crackle of the flames. "Let's make tonight unforgettable," Sophie said, grinning as she passed around a flask of whiskey. "No phones, no distractions. Just us, the stars, and the wilderness." We laughed and drank, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that clung to the air. The fire burned brightly, casting long shadows across the ground. But as the night wore on, the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching further into the trees, as if they were alive, waiting. It wasn't until later, after the fire had burned low and the first stars had begun to appear in the sky, that we heard the sound. At first, it was faint, just a whisper on the wind. But then it became clearer, a faint rustling in the trees, like footsteps. "Probably just an animal," Michael said, but his voice was tight with tension. We sat in silence, listening. The rustling grew louder, closer. I felt my heart race. It was too deliberate to be an animal. The footsteps were too rhythmic, too human. "Guys, I think we should check this out," Alex said, standing up. "Maybe someone's lost." I wasn't sure why, but I didn't feel safe. Something about the way the footsteps seemed to draw closer with every passing second made me want to stay put. But Alex was already moving toward the tree line, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Alex, don't," I called out, my voice strained. "We should stay by the fire." But it was too late. Alex was already gone, disappearing into the shadows. Minutes dragged by in complete silence. We sat, waiting for him to return, but there was no sound, no footsteps, no crackling leaves underfoot, nothing. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Where is he?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature had dropped. The warmth of the fire felt miles away. Then, just as we were about to call for him, we heard it. A scream. A long, agonized scream that cut through the air like a knife. "Alex!" I shouted, standing up, but no one answered. The scream echoed again, distant but unmistakably human. Panic set in as I rushed toward the direction where Alex had gone. Sophie and Michael followed closely behind. The darkness enveloped us as we moved deeper into the woods, the firelight now far behind. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting in strange shapes as if they were alive, watching. The rustling from earlier returned, louder now, moving with us, keeping pace as we rushed through the woods. We reached a clearing. There, in the middle of it, was Alex. He was standing motionless, staring blankly ahead, his face pale and empty, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Alex!" I ran toward him, but the moment I touched his shoulder, he collapsed into my arms, his body limp. "Is he okay?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know. He wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't himself. His eyes remained vacant, and his breathing was shallow. Then, he spoke, his voice low, barely a whisper. "They're watching. They're always watching." Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further. A deep, unsettling growl reverberated through the trees, low and guttural. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that made the very ground beneath our feet feel as if it were alive. We backed away slowly, not sure what to do. The whispering began again, louder this time, coming from all directions. The trees seemed to close in tighter, and the shadows stretched unnaturally far. "Run," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to leave." But the forest wouldn't let us go. We ran, but the trees seemed to shift, paths disappearing behind us, as if we were being herded deeper into the woods. The whispers became clearer, forming words that we couldn't understand. The sound of footsteps followed us, always just behind us. At that moment, we realized something terrible. We were not alone. The forest had claimed us, and we were now part of it. Forever. The last thing I remember before the darkness consumed us was a pair of glowing eyes in the distance, watching us, waiting. And then, everything went black. The cursed campground, haunted by ghosts in the wild. In the heart of a forgotten wilderness, hidden deep within a dark forest, there was a campsite that no one dared to enter. Local legend spoke of its curse, of people who ventured into the woods and either vanished without a trace or returned with broken minds, haunted by eerie whispers and the sensation of being watched by something far beyond human. It was a place avoided by all, its very name feared. Lucas from Brazil, Emma from Germany, Alessandro from Italy, and Maria from Spain, however, did not believe in such superstitions. Eager to explore the unknown, they set off for a weekend adventure, determined to uncover the truth behind the mysterious stories. Armed with backpacks, cameras, and an old map that Lucas had found, they arrived at the remote site as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the ancient trees. The forest seemed alive, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like the fingers of long-dead spirits. At first, everything felt calm. They laughed and joked as they set up camp, roasting marshmallows and telling stories around the fire. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The forest grew darker, and the air felt thick, as if something was waiting just beyond the light. Maria, ever sensitive to the energy of a place, began to hear soft whispers carried by the wind, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave, you shouldn't be here," she heard, her heart racing. She turned to the others, her voice shaking, but they dismissed it. "It's just the wind," Alessandro said, shrugging it off. But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The whispers continued, growing louder as the hours passed. The fire flickered wildly, casting odd shadows on the ground. Maria's unease deepened, and she felt as though the forest itself was alive, watching them. Despite her fear, she kept quiet, unsure of what to do. Then, the next morning, they set out to explore the area, hoping that a hike would help shake the strange feeling that had settled over them. They wandered deeper into the woods, and after hours of walking, they stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. The walls were rotting, and the roof caved in, but something about it called to them. As they entered, the air inside was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. On the central wooden table, words were carved deeply into the surface, as if someone had used a knife to etch them. The message was chilling: "No one who stays here ever leaves." Maria's heart skipped a beat as she read the words aloud. The others laughed it off as a prank left by previous campers, but Maria could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As they left the cabin, the tension in the air grew, and the forest around them seemed darker, closer. They returned to the campsite and tried to relax around the fire again, but everything had changed. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to howl through the trees. Then, without warning, Alessandro screamed. The others rushed to him, and when they found him standing in the middle of the campsite, his face was pale and his eyes wide with terror. "Something touched me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I felt a hand on my shoulder. But when I turned, there was no one there." Panic set in. They tried to brush it off his nerves, but fear clung to them now like a dark cloud. As the night wore on, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in the trees seemed to move, and the wind picked up, making the flames of the campfire dance erratically. Then, Maria heard it again, the whispers. This time, they were clearer, more urgent. "Get out. Now, before it's too late." The fire flickered and went out, leaving them in total darkness. They could hear footsteps approaching, but when they looked, there was no one there. The temperature dropped sharply, and the forest around them seemed to come alive with strange sounds, branches cracking, rustling leaves, growls in the distance. Maria's heart raced as she felt something cold and invisible brush past her. She turned, but there was nothing. Her mind screamed that they needed to leave, but when they tried to pack up and flee, something was blocking their path. Then, in the midst of the chaos, Alessandro vanished. His tent was empty, his belongings scattered around the campsite, and the only sound was the faint echo of his voice, calling for help, somewhere deep in the woods. They searched frantically, calling his name, but he was gone. No trace of Alessandro was ever found. Desperate, the group returned to the cabin, hoping to find some clue, some way to understand what was happening. As they approached the door, they saw fresh words etched into the wood: "One must stay." The horror of the situation settled in, and they realized the truth: the curse of the campground had claimed Alessandro. They fled in terror, but the woods seemed to follow them, an unshakable presence pressing in from all sides. Back in the city, They tried to report Alessandro's disappearance, but there was no sign of him anywhere. People dismissed it as just another mystery, another disappearance in the woods. Yet, some say that if you stand near the cursed campground on a dark night, you can still hear the faint cries of those lost, and the words carved into the cabin door change every year. The last time anyone checked, the message had read, "The next one is you."